The night she was sold wasn't just betrayal. It was proof that she had never truly belonged to anyone. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with tension, power, and something far more dangerous than violence. Control. It wasn't the kind of place people entered willingly. Hidden beneath layers of silence and guarded secrecy, the underground meeting space existed outside the rules of law and morality. Deals made here didn't just shift money or territory. They decided lives. And tonight, one of those lives was Arya Vale. She stood still, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had learned long ago that fear, in a room like this, had no value. It did not protect. It did not change outcomes. It only exposed weakness. And weakness was something none of them tolerated. The men around her were not loud. They did not need to be. Their presence carried authority without effort. Their silence heavier than any threat. Every movement was deliberate. Every glance calculated. This was not chaos. It was structure, a system built on power and enforced through control. At the center of it stood Dante Moretti. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't move unnecessarily. His presence alone dictated the rhythm of the room. There was something about him that made everything else feel secondary. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more absolute. Dante was not unpredictable. He was precise, and that made him dangerous. Arya knew that better than anyone. There had been a time when standing near him meant something different. Not safety. He was not the kind of man who offered safety, but something close to it. Stability, perhaps. A defined place in a world where most people were disposable. Under Dante's control, she had not been free, but she had not been unprotected either. And in a world like this, that difference mattered. But tonight, something had changed. Across from him stood Victor Kane. Where Dante was controlled, Victor was something else entirely. There was no refinement in his presence, no quiet precision. His power felt sharper, more unpredictable. Like something that did not follow rules because it didn't need to. Victor did not create order. He thrived in disruption. And the space between them was not just tension. It was war. Arya could feel it without needing to understand the details. The air carried history. Unspoken, unresolved, dangerous. Whatever existed between these two men was not recent. It had been building. And tonight, it had reached a point where something had to be exchanged. Something valuable, something significant, something like her. The realization did not come suddenly. It unfolded, slowly, quietly, as the pieces around her began to align. The positioning of the men, the calculated silence, the way no one looked at her directly. But everyone was aware of her presence. She was not here as an observer. She was here as part of the deal. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with sharp clarity. In a world built on power, people are not protected, they are positioned. And she had just been positioned. Arya did not move. She did not speak. She did not allow the shift inside her to surface. Because reacting now would change nothing. The decision had already been made. That was the truth. And truth, in this world, was final. Dante remained still, his expression unreadable. His focus not on her, but on Victor. That was what unsettled her the most. Not the danger, not the environment, not even the realization of what was happening, but him. Because if there was one thing she understood about Dante Moretti, it was this. He never allowed something valuable to leave his control, unless he chose to. The thought settled heavily, and with it came something sharp in fear. Understanding. This was not loss. This was intention. The exchange did not happen dramatically. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, no visible conflict. It was handled the way everything in this world was handled. Quietly, precisely, without unnecessary emotion. A shift in position, a subtle acknowledgement, a decision carried out without needing to be spoken. And just like that, she was no longer his. The moment should have broken her, but it didn't. Because breaking requires expectation, and somewhere deep beneath everything she had learned to suppress, she had already known that nothing in this world was permanent, not protection, not control, not even position, especially not position. Victor's men moved next, not aggressively, not carelessly, but with certainty. They did not need to force her, because resistance in this moment would serve no purpose. Arya stepped forward on her own, controlled, composed, unwilling to give them the one thing they would expect from her, fear. But inside, everything shifted, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, because there is a difference between being controlled and being discarded, and this was the latter. The space between her and Dante closed slowly, step by step, distance replacing proximity, connection, whatever it had been, replaced by absence. She did not look at him immediately, because looking would make it real, and part of her was not ready for that. But eventually, she did, just once, just enough, and what she saw changed everything. There was no hesitation in his expression, no conflict, no sign of regret, nothing that suggested this decision had cost him anything. Only control, complete, unshaken, absolute. That was the moment it settled, not as pain, not as shock, but as truth. She had never belonged to him, not in the way she thought, not in the way she had allowed herself to believe. She had been useful, positioned, valuable, until she wasn't, and now she had been replaced. The realization did not break her. It hardened her, because once you understand your position, you stop expecting it to change. The room faded slightly as she was led away, not physically, but mentally. The weight of what had just happened did not overwhelm her. It structured her thoughts, sharpened her awareness, redirected her focus, because survival does not depend on emotion. It depends on clarity. And she was very clear now. Dante had not lost her. He had given her away. The difference was everything. Victor's presence grew stronger as the distance increased, not because he moved closer, but because she was now within his world, and his world was different, less controlled, more volatile, more dangerous. She could feel in the way the environment shifted, in the way the men around her carried themselves, in the absence of the structured precision she had grown used to under Dante. This was not stability. This was unpredictability, and unpredictability was far more dangerous. But even as she stepped into that unknown, one thought remained fixed in her mind, one question she could not ignore. Why? Because men like Dante Moretti did not make moves without reason, and this was too deliberate to be random. There was something behind it, something she had not yet seen, something that made her more valuable in Victor's hands than in his own. The realization lingered, unfinished, unresolved, and deeply unsettling, because if this was not abandonment, then it was strategy, and strategy always comes with consequences. As the distance between them became final, as the control that once defined her position disappeared completely, Arya allowed herself one last look, not out of emotion, not out of attachment, but out of understanding. And in that final moment, she saw it, not hesitation, not regret, but something else, something colder, something far more intentional than she had expected. This had been planned from the beginning, and that realization settled into her with undeniable force. Because if this was planned, then she had never been safe, not even with him. As she was taken away, one truth remained, sharp, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. Dante didn't try to stop it. He didn't lose her. He allowed her to be taken. The moment Arya was removed from that room did not end anything. It clarified everything. As the distance between her and Dante Moretti became real, not symbolic, not temporary, but absolute, her mind did not move forward. It moved backward, because understanding what had just happened required understanding what had existed before it. And what had existed between them was never simple. Dante had never been a man who offered explanations. He did not define relationships. He did not name connections. He did not give meaning to anything that could weaken control. And yet, what existed between him and Arya had always been something more than nothing, but never enough to be called something real. That was the truth she had avoided. Until now, her past with him had not begun with trust. It had begun with necessity. She had entered his world the same way most people did, without choice, positioned, observed, evaluated. In a system where survival depended on usefulness, she had learned quickly: adapt, observe, do not break, and somehow she had survived, not because she was protected, but because she became valuable. That was how Dante worked. He did not keep people because he cared. He kept them because they served a purpose. And Arya had served one well enough to remain. But somewhere along the way, something shifted, not dramatically, not openly, but enough. Dante's attention toward her had always been controlled, but it had not been indifferent. There were moments, brief, almost invisible, where his focus lingered longer than necessary, where his presence felt less like observation and more like awareness. It was not kindness, it was not warmth, but it was not nothing. And in a world where nothing was given freely, even that felt significant. Arya had never misunderstood him. Not completely. She knew what he was, what he represented, what he was capable of. But understanding someone does not prevent connection, and connection does not require words. The intellectual hook formed within her, sharper now than ever before. In a world where nothing is real, even the illusion of connection can feel like truth. That was what she had believed. That somewhere within his control, within his calculated silence, within his structured presence, there had been something real, something that placed her differently, something that meant she was not disposable. But now, that belief no longer held, because if it had been real, he would have stopped it. That was the part she could not escape, not the betrayal, not the exchange, not even the fact that she had been handed over like a transaction, but the silence. Dante had not resisted. He had not hesitated. He had not even acknowledged the shift in a way that suggested conflict. He had allowed it. And that single truth rewrote everything. As she was moved deeper into Victor Kane's world, her surroundings shifted, but her focus did not. Her thoughts remained fixed on the same point, circling it, analyzing it, trying to break it down into something that made sense. Because Dante Moretti did not make careless decisions. He did not give away assets without reason. He did not lose control, which meant this was not loss. It was choice, and that choice carried meaning. The question formed again, stronger now, unavoidable. Why didn't he stop it? It wasn't just about power. Dante had the power. That had never been in question. If he had wanted to stop it, he would have. If he had wanted to keep her, he could have. So why didn't he? The emotional conflict that followed was not simple. It was layered, sharp, unresolved. Hurt came first, but not in the way it once might have. It was not overwhelming. It did not weaken her. It settled into something colder, something more controlled, something that demanded understanding instead of reaction. Because pain, when left unanswered, turns into clarity, and clarity demands truth. Confusion followed. Not about what had happened, but about what it meant. The past she had understood now felt incomplete. The moments she had interpreted one way now carried different weight. Every interaction, every detail, every silence between them shifted because context had changed. And context changes everything. Arya replayed it all, not emotionally, but analytically, the way he had observed her, the way he had allowed her to remain. The way he had never defined what she was to him, but had never treated her as insignificant either. It had not been ownership, but it had not been nothing. So what had it been? The answer did not come easily, because what existed between them had never been designed to be understood. It had been designed to function, and function does not require explanation. But now, explanation was all she needed, because without it, everything felt false. The further she moved from him, the clearer one truth became. She had never truly understood her position. Not fully, not completely. She had believed she held value. But value, she realized now, is conditional. And conditions change. The realization should have broken something inside her, but it didn't, because she had already begun to change. The Arya whom I felt lost, abandoned, or weakened by this no longer existed. In her place stood someone else, someone who no longer needed to believe in illusion, someone who needed truth, no matter how cold it was. And the truth was this: Dante had never belonged to her. and she had never belonged to him. But that did not answer the deeper question, because if there had been nothing, why had it ever felt like something? The contradiction remained, unresolved, and that made it dangerous, because uncertainty creates attachment, and attachment creates vulnerability. Arya forced her thoughts back into structure. Emotion would not give her answers. Only observation would. She began to reconstruct everything she knew about him, not as someone connected to her, but as a system. His behavior, his patterns, his decisions, the way he operated within power. Because Dante Moretti did not act without purpose, and if he had allowed her to be taken, then she was still part of that purpose. The thought landed with quiet force. This was not the end of her value. It was a shift in it. But that realization brought something else with it, something darker, because if she was still valuable, then she had not been discarded. She had been placed, and placement always served a function. The implications settled into her slowly, but completely. This was not just about him letting her go. It was about where he had allowed her to go. Victor Kane, his enemy, the one man whose world operated differently, more unpredictable, more dangerous, less controlled. Why there? Why him? The question sharpened, because the answer would change everything. And somewhere within that answer was the truth about her, not just her past, but her role, her purpose, her position in something far bigger than she had been allowed to see. The realization did not bring comfort. It brought focus, because now she understood one thing clearly. She had not been abandoned. She had been used. And that was far more dangerous. As the thought settled fully into place, one final question emerged. Quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Was she ever important to him? Or just useful? If she thought Dante was dangerous, she had no idea what his enemy was capable of. The shift from Dante's world to Victor Kane's was not immediate. It unfolded, slowly, like stepping out of structure and into something that had no intention of being controlled. Arya felt it before she understood it. The difference was not in what she saw. It was in what she couldn't predict. Dante's world had always operated with precision. Every movement had purpose. Every decision followed logic. Even danger had rules, unspoken, but consistent enough to be understood. Victor's world had none, and that absence of structure was the first thing she noticed. The environment itself felt different, not chaotic in the way of disorder, but chaotic in the way of unpredictability. There was no rhythm to follow, no pattern to anticipate, no system to learn and adapt to, and that made it more dangerous, because control, even when oppressive, can be studied, but chaos cannot. Arya did not react outwardly. She did not allow the shift to show, but internally, everything adjusted. Her instincts sharpened, her awareness expanded, because in a world like this, survival did not depend on understanding the system. It depended on recognizing that there was none. Victor Kane's presence defined that reality. He did not carry himself like Dante. There was no stillness in him, no quiet control, no refined restraint. Where Dante had been precise, Victor was unpredictable. His power did not come from structure. It came from disruption, and disruption is harder to survive. Arya observed him carefully, not directly, but enough to understand what she was dealing with. His movements lacked the calculated consistency she had grown used to. His attention shifted without warning. His decisions did not always follow visible logic. And yet, there was control, just not the kind she understood. That was what unsettled her, because unpredictability, when intentional, is its own form of power. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with sharp clarity. The most dangerous system is the one that doesn't need to follow rules. Victor Kane did not need rules, and that made him more dangerous than Dante in a way she had not expected. Her position within this new world became clear almost immediately. She had no protection, no defined role, no structure placed within the system. Under Dante, she had been positioned. Here, she was undefined, and undefined means expendable. The realization did not create panic. It created focus, because panic wastes time, and time, in this environment, was not something she could afford to lose. Arya adjusted quickly, Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She reduced her presence, observed more than she moved, listened more than she reacted. Every decision became calculated, not based on what she understood, but based on what she could not predict, because unpredictability requires caution, and caution keeps you alive. The psychological pressure began to build, not from direct threat, but from uncertainty. There were no clear boundaries, no defined expectations, no visible rules that could guide behavior, and that absence was suffocating, because in Dante's world, control created limits. Here, there were none, and without limits, everything becomes possible. That was the fear, not immediate danger, but the potential for it at any moment. Arya felt it in the way people moved around her, the way interactions carried an edge she could not fully define. The way silence here felt different, less controlled, more unstable, as if it could shift into something else without warning. She did not allow it to break her, but she acknowledged it, because ignoring fear does not remove it. Understanding it does, and what she understood now was simple. This world was not built to contain chaos. It was built to thrive in it. The contrast between Dante and Victor became clearer with every moment. Dante had been controlled danger, predictable, structured, strategic. Victor was something else entirely, unpredictable, volatile, uncontained. Where Dante's presence had created a system you could learn, Victor's presence created a space you could only survive, and survival requires something different. Arya adapted, not perfectly, but effectively. She stopped looking for patterns, stopped trying to understand the system, stopped expecting consistency. Instead, she focused on one thing: observation, because even in chaos, there are fragments, moments, details, and those details can be used. Her awareness sharpened further, not just of her surroundings, but of herself, her reactions, her instincts, her control. Because in a world that lacks structure, you become your own structure, and that is the only way to survive. Days passed, then more. Time in Victor's world did not feel linear. It shifted, unpredictable, unstable, and within that instability, Arya began to notice something else, something subtle, something beneath the surface, a pattern, not in the chaos itself, but in how she had been placed within it. At first, it felt like coincidence, the way certain interactions aligned, the way her position shifted slightly, but never randomly, the way she was exposed to certain situations, but not others. It wasn't obvious, but it wasn't accidental either. The realization formed slowly, carefully, piece by piece, because patterns, even in chaos, reveal intention, and intention suggests design. The thought unsettled her more than anything else, because chaos, when real, is unpredictable, but chaos, when controlled, is something else entirely. And what she was beginning to see did not feel random. It felt directed. The idea took hold, not fully, not completely, but enough to create doubt, enough to create suspicion, enough to make her question the one thing she had accepted since the moment she was taken, that she had been sold. Because now, it no longer felt that simple. The placement, the timing, the alignment of events, none of it felt accidental anymore. And if it wasn't accidental, then it was intentional. And if it was intentional, then there was a reason. The realization settled into her with quiet intensity, sharp, unavoidable, and deeply unsettling, because it changed everything. She had not just been removed from Dante's control. She had been placed into Victor's world, and placement always has purpose. Arya stood still, not physically, but mentally, as the truth began to form completely, not as a question, but as a conclusion. This was not a transaction. This was strategy, and she was part of it. As the understanding locked into place, one final realization followed, cold, precise, and impossible to ignore. She realized that she wasn't just sold. She was placed here for a reason. The truth wasn't that she was abandoned. It was that she was part of something much bigger. Once the idea took hold, that her transfer into Victor Kane's world had not been random. it refused to let go. Arya could not return to ignorance, because once a pattern is seen, it demands to be understood. The environment around her remained the same, unpredictable, unstable, impossible to fully control, but her perception of it had shifted. What once felt like chaos now carried fragments of something else. Structure, not obvious, not consistent, but present. And that presence changed everything, because chaos, when observed closely enough, begins to reveal intention. Arya stopped reacting to her surroundings as something she needed to survive, and started observing them as something she needed to understand. That was a shift, not emotional, not visible, but strategic. The first clue did not come as a revelation. It came as a detail, small, almost insignificant, something easily ignored. But she didn't ignore it, because she had learned something important. The truth does not hide in what is obvious. It hides in what feels out of place. A movement, a decision, a sequence of events that did not fully align with the unpredictability around her. Victor's world thrived on instability, but certain outcomes remained consistent. Certain interactions repeated. Certain results appeared too controlled to be part of true chaos. And that contradiction was the first crack. Arya followed it carefully, not directly, not aggressively, but with precision, because if this was intentional, then it was designed not to be seen. And anything designed not to be seen must be approached carefully. She began to trace the inconsistencies, not as isolated moments, but as part of a sequence, patterns within unpredictability, structure within disruption, the way certain situations aligned just enough to feel deliberate, even within a system that appeared uncontrolled. And slowly, the pattern expanded. It connected, not just within Victor's world, but beyond it. The realization did not come immediately, but when it did, it changed everything, because the pattern did not begin here. It reached back, further than she expected, further than she had ever considered, to her past, to events she had once believed were separate, independent, unrelated. Now, they aligned. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with sharp clarity. Nothing that is carefully planned ever feels planned until you see the pattern behind it. And now, she saw it. Her past was not as disconnected as she had believed. There were moments, decisions, opportunities, losses that had once felt like circumstance, things she had accepted without question because they had not appeared unusual at the time. But now, they felt different because they aligned, not perfectly, but enough to suggest that her path had not been entirely her own. The thought should have been overwhelming. It wasn't, because she had already crossed the threshold of awareness, and once crossed, there is no return. Arya moved deeper into the pattern, carefully, deliberately, allowing each piece to connect before moving to the next, because rushing would lead to assumption, and assumption would lead to error. She focused on what she knew, her past, her position, her connection to Dante, and as she did, the structure became clearer, not complete, but undeniable. There had been a conflict, long before she understood it, long before she was aware of the world she would eventually become part of, a conflict between power, between control, between men like Dante Moretti and Victor Kane. It had not been visible to her, but it had existed, and somehow she was connected to it, not directly, not obviously, but significantly enough to matter. The realization shifted something inside her, not fear, not confusion, but awareness, because if she was connected to something bigger, then her position was not accidental, it was intentional, and intention has purpose. The emotional transition followed, but it was not what she expected. Fear did not intensify. It transformed, because fear relies on the unknown, and the more she understood, the less unknown remained. In its place was something else. Clarity, sharp, focused, dangerous, because clarity removes hesitation, and hesitation is what keeps people controlled. Arya was no longer controlled by confusion. She was guided by understanding, and that made her dangerous. The final piece came quietly, not dramatic, not obvious, but complete. It appeared as alignment, a connection between her past, her present, and the moment she had been transferred from Dante's control to Victor's world. A connection that could not be ignored, because it was too precise, too deliberate, too perfect. The realization formed fully now, not as a theory, but as truth. She had not been abandoned. She had not been discarded. She had been positioned, and that positioning was part of something larger, something strategic, something ongoing, something that had been in motion long before she understood it. The weight of that truth settled into her, but it did not break her. It strengthened her, because now she understood her value, not as a person, not as an individual, but as a piece. And pieces are only important within a game, which meant one thing. There was a game, and she was inside it. The final question remained, the most important one, the one everything now pointed toward. Who had placed her? The answer did not require time. It did not require further analysis. It did not require confirmation, because it was already there, clear, unavoidable. Dante Moretti. The realization hit with quiet force, not shocking, not unexpected, but undeniable, because everything aligned with him. The precision, the control, the long-term structure, the ability to manipulate outcomes without revealing intention. This was his design, his strategy, his move, and she was part of it. The emotional impact followed, but it was different now. Not pain, not betrayal, but something far more complex. Understanding mixed with something darker, because if he had planned this, then everything she had believed about their connection was incomplete, or worse, constructed. The thought lingered, unsettling, unresolved, and deeply dangerous, because it changed the nature of everything between them. This was not just about control, not just about power, not just about survival. This was about strategy, and strategy does not leave room for emotion. As the realization settled completely into place, one final truth emerged, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. She uncovers something shocking. Dante planned this from the beginning. The moment she stopped fearing them, she became dangerous. The truth had changed her, not emotionally, not visibly, but structurally. Once Arya understood that she had not been abandoned, but strategically placed, something inside her shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The confusion that once clouded her thinking disappeared. The fear that had once shaped her reactions lost its control, because fear depends on uncertainty, and she was no longer uncertain. She knew where she stood, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a piece in something far larger. And pieces can be moved, but they can also learn the board. That was the difference now. Arya stopped seeing herself as someone trapped inside Victor Kane's world. She started seeing herself as someone studying it. The transformation did not come with dramatic change. It came with stillness. Her movements became quieter, not weaker, but more deliberate. Her reactions became controlled, not suppressed, but intentional. Every action she took carried purpose, even if that purpose was simply to observe without being noticed, because visibility was vulnerability, and she had no intention of being vulnerable anymore. The intellectual hook settled into her with quiet precision. The moment you understand the system you're trapped in, you stop being controlled by it. That was the shift. She was no longer reacting to her environment. She was analyzing it. Victor's world remained unpredictable, but unpredictability, she realized, did not mean randomness. There were still patterns, even within chaos. Not obvious ones, not consistent ones, but fragments of structure hidden beneath the instability. And she began to find them, not quickly, not easily, but effectively. She paid attention to timing, to movement, to how people responded when pressure was applied, to which situations escalated and which ones didn't, to where control existed, even in a place that appeared to reject it, because even chaos needs direction, and direction leaves traces. Arya followed those traces carefully, not outwardly, not in ways that could be seen, but internally, building a map, a structure, a way to navigate something that was never meant to be navigated. And slowly, it worked. Her position began to stabilize. not through power, but through understanding. She no longer felt like she was moving blindly through Victor's world. She knew where to stand, where to remain unseen, where to act, and where to stay still. That control was hers, not given, not allowed, but taken, silently. Victor Kane noticed, not immediately, but inevitably, because men like him did not ignore change. They observed it, analyzed it, measured it over time. And Arya had changed. The first thing he noticed was the absence of fear. Not complete absence, but enough to disrupt expectation. Situations that once should have unsettled her no longer produced visible reaction. Moments designed to create pressure did not affect her the way they should have. Her presence, once cautious and reactive, became controlled and deliberate, and that was unusual. Victor did not react outwardly. He did not confront her. He did not question her, but his attention shifted toward her, not aggressively, not directly, but intentionally. The way he observed her change, subtle but precise. Arya felt it, not as pressure, but as awareness. She was being watched, not as a threat, not yet, but as something that did not fully align with expectation. And that meant one thing. She had been noticed. The realization did not unsettle her. It confirmed her position, because attention, when controlled, can be managed, and she knew how to manage it. She adjusted, not by retreating, but by refining. Her movements became even more precise, her reactions even more controlled. She allowed just enough vulnerability to remain visible, just enough to maintain the illusion that she was still adapting, still surviving, still reacting, because illusion was now her greatest tool. Victor continued to observe, and the more he did, the less she made sense. She did not break under pressure. She did not resist openly. She did not attempt to escape. She existed within his world, but she did not belong to it, and that difference held his attention. What began as observation shifted into something else. Curiosity, not emotional, not personal, but strategic, because unpredictability requires understanding, and understanding requires focus. Victor's focus on her sharpened, not constantly, not obsessively, but consistently. He began to notice details. The way she moved through space without drawing attention. The way she positioned herself within situations. The way her presence remained controlled. Even in environments that lacked structure, it did not align. And anything that does not align must be understood. Arya recognized a shift, not through direct interaction, but through subtle change. The way certain situations adjusted around her. The way her presence was accounted for, slightly but deliberately. The way the environment seemed to respond to her, even when she remained silent. It was not control, but it was influence. And influence is the beginning of power. Her transformation was complete, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally. She was no longer surviving Victor's world. She was navigating it. And navigation creates control, even if that control is limited, even if it is temporary, even if it exists only within understanding. It was enough, because enough is all survival requires. The silent shift from victim to strategist changed everything, not in the system, but in her position within it. And position determines outcome. Victor's awareness of her deepened, not because she forced it, but because she could no longer be ignored. She had become something else. Not a threat, not yet, but no longer insignificant. And that was dangerous, because insignificance keeps you safe, but significance draws attention. The balance between visibility and invisibility became critical. Arya maintained it carefully. Every move calculated, every reaction measured, every detail controlled, because one mistake would expose everything, and exposure would end everything. The tension between them remained silent, unspoken, unacknowledged, but present, growing, because awareness, once established, does not disappear. It evolves, and what it was evolving into was unpredictable. Victor was no longer simply observing his world. He was observing her within it, and that shift changed the game. Arya held her position, not as resistance, but as control, because she no longer needed to fight the system. She only needed to understand it, and understanding was already giving her power. As the balance between observation and awareness settled into place, one final truth emerged. Quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Victor begins to suspect she's not as helpless as she pretends to be. Just when she believed he had abandoned her, he came back, and everything changed. The shift in Victor Kane's attention toward her had already begun to alter the balance. Arya had learned how to move within his world without being consumed by it. She had adapted, observed, and slowly carved out a space where she was no longer simply reacting. She was thinking, calculating, positioning herself within something she now understood. But control, no matter how carefully built, is never permanent, because some forces do not disappear. They return, and when they do, they change everything. Dante Moretti did not arrive with noise. He never did. There was no announcement, no warning, no visible disruption that signaled his presence before it happened. The shift came the way it always did with him. Quiet, controlled, but absolute. The atmosphere changed first. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. Enough for those who understood power to feel it. Because real power does not need to be seen. It is recognized. Arya felt it before she saw him. The subtle tightening of space. The way movement around her adjusted slightly, almost instinctively. The way silence began to carry weight. Not unstable, like Victor's world, but controlled, deliberate, familiar, structured. That was the difference. Victor's world had always felt unpredictable, but this felt precise, and precision belonged to one man. The realization hit her instantly. Dante, he had returned, not as memory, not as absence, but as presence, and with him came control. Arya did not move. She did not react. But internally, something shifted, sharp, immediate, undeniable. Not fear, not relief. Something far more complicated, because his return did not answer anything. It raised more questions. Why now? Why here? And most importantly, why her? The intellectual hook settled into her with quiet intensity. The man who lets you go without resistance is the same man who returns when it benefits him. That was the truth she had to hold on to, because anything else would be dangerous. Dante entered Victor's world the way he entered everything. With certainty, he did not adapt to the environment. The environment adjusted to him. That was what made him different. Where Victor thrived in unpredictability, Dante imposed structure. Where Victor disrupted control, Dante redefined it. And when those two forces occupied the same space, it was not balance. It was conflict. The tension between them was immediate, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. Two systems, two forms of power. Two men who did not operate the same way, but understood each other completely. And between them was her. Arya remained still, her awareness sharpened to a level she had never experienced before. This was no longer about survival. This was no longer about adaptation. This was something else entirely. This was positioning at the highest level, because whatever was happening now was bigger than her, but still centered around her. Dante's presence near her was not immediate. He did not approach her directly. He did not acknowledge her in a way that others could interpret, but she felt it, the shift in his attention. Not soft, not emotional, but precise, focused, intentional. It was the same presence she remembered, but stronger now, more defined, more dangerous, because this time she understood it. The emotional tension that followed was not simple. It did not manifest as relief or anger alone. It existed as both, simultaneously, unresolved, because seeing him again did not erase what happened. It amplified it. He had let her go. That truth remained, unchanged, unforgiven. But now he had come back, and that contradiction was impossible to ignore. Arya did not look at him immediately, because looking would mean acknowledging something she had not yet decided how to define. But eventually, she did, and what she saw was not what she expected. Dante had not changed, not visibly. His presence remained controlled, his expression unreadable, his focus as precise as ever. But there was something else, something deeper, something that had not been there before. Intensity, not emotional, but directed, as if his attention toward her was no longer passive. It was intentional, and that changed everything. Victor noticed it too, the shift between them, the subtle alignment of attention, the unspoken awareness that passed between Dante and Arya without a single word being exchanged. And that awareness created tension, because in a world like this, attention is power, and power is contested. The space between Dante and Victor sharpened, not through confrontation, but through presence, each aware of the other, each measuring, each calculating, because neither of them acted without purpose. And this moment had purpose. Arya understood that now. She was not just witnessing a power clash. She was part of it. The realization settled into her with clarity. This was not coincidence. This was continuation. Whatever had begun before, whatever had placed her into Victor's world, had not ended. It had evolved. And Dante's return was part of that evolution. The emotional weight of that truth did not overwhelm her. It stabilized her, because now she understood her position more clearly than ever before. She was not a victim, not a prisoner, not even just a piece. She was something else, something central, and that made her dangerous. Dante moved closer, not directly, not aggressively, but enough to shift the space around her, enough to make his presence undeniable, enough to remind her of something she had almost forgotten, what it felt like to stand within his control. But this time, it felt different, because she was no longer the same person. She did not shrink. She did not react. She did not fall back into the position she had once held. She remained steady, and that did not go unnoticed. The silent exchange between them carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because everything that needed to be understood already was. He had let her go. She had survived without him. He had returned. And now, everything between them was different, not broken, not resolved, but changed. The question remained, unanswered, unavoidable. Why? Why had he come back? Not for control, not for power, not for territory. Because if it had been any of those things, this would have looked different. This was something else. And Arya saw it, not immediately, but clearly enough, in the way his attention did not leave her, in the way his presence shifted toward her, even within a space dominated by conflict, in the way everything else seemed secondary. To her, the realization formed slowly, but once it did, it could not be undone. This was not about saving her. It had never been, because men like Dante Moretti did not save. They claimed, and that was the truth, the one she could not ignore, the one she could not escape, the one that changed everything. As the tension between power, control, and something far more personal settled into place, one final realization emerged, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. He didn't come to save her. He came to claim her. The truth didn't just explain his actions. It made walking away impossible. The moment Arya understood that Dante had not come back to save her, but to claim her, something deeper began to unravel, not around her, but within everything she thought she understood. Because if he had planned her removal and now returned to reclaim her, then this was never about losing control. It was about controlling something far bigger than she had seen. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt loaded, heavy with everything that had not been said, but no longer needed to be, because understanding had replaced confusion, and clarity had replaced fear. Arya did not move toward him. She did not step away either. She remained exactly where she was, balanced between two forces that had shaped everything around her. Victor Kane, Dante Moretti, chaos and control. And she was the point where both collided. The truth did not come in the form of words. It came through alignment, through everything she had already seen, everything she had already connected, everything that now fit together with undeniable precision. Dante had let her go, not because he couldn't stop it, but because he needed it to happen. That was the first truth. And once accepted, everything else followed. The intellectual hook settled into her with sharp clarity. Sometimes betrayal isn't meant to destroy you. It's meant to place you exactly where you need to be. That was a shift. The betrayal had not been the end. It had been the beginning. Arya reconstructed the sequence, not emotionally, but strategically. Her transfer into Victor's world, the instability she had navigated, the patterns she had uncovered, the connections to her past. It all aligned into something larger, a structure, a plan, a war, not visible, not obvious, but real, and she had been placed at the center of it. Dante had not removed her from his control. He had repositioned her within a system he could not access directly. Victor's world, his enemy's territory, the one place where direct power would fail, but indirect influence could succeed. And that influence had been her. The realization did not weaken her. It strengthened her, because now she understood her value completely, not as a person, but as leverage. And leverage is power. The emotional conflict followed, but it was far from simple. Betrayal remained, sharp, unforgiven, because no matter the reason, he had still let her go. He had still placed her into a world where survival was not guaranteed. He had still allowed her to face something that could have destroyed her, and that could not be erased. But alongside that betrayal was something else, something equally powerful. Protection, not the kind she had once believed in, not direct, not visible, but strategic, because placing her within Victor's world had not just exposed her to danger. It had positioned her where she could not be easily eliminated, where her presence created tension, where removing her would carry consequences. Dante had not protected her by keeping her close. He had protected her by making her essential, and that realization changed everything, because protection, when done this way, is not kindness, it is control. The conflict between those two truths, betrayal and protection, settled into her, unresolved but undeniable. She could not reject one without acknowledging the other, and that made walking away impossible, because if he had simply betrayed her, she could have left. If he had simply protected her, she could have trusted him. But this was both, and something more, something far more dangerous. Dante's focus on her did not waver, not even now, not even as the truth settled fully between them. His presence remained controlled. But there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before, something that had grown, developed, strengthened, obsession, not emotional, not uncontrolled, but undeniable, because she had survived his plan, because she had adapted beyond expectation, because she had become something he had not fully designed, but now could not ignore. She was no longer just part of the strategy. She had become something else, something personal. And that shift changed everything. Victor saw it, the tension between them, the alignment of focus, the silent connection that existed despite everything that had happened. And that recognition created pressure, because power was no longer just external. It had become internal. Between them, Arya felt it, not as weakness, but as weight, because understanding him did not remove what he had done. It made it more complex, more layered, more difficult to define. She was no longer standing in ignorance. She was standing in truth. And truth does not simplify anything. It complicates everything. The dynamic between them reached its peak, not through confrontation, not through action, but through understanding. Everything had been revealed. Everything had been aligned. Everything had been exposed. And yet, nothing had ended, because ending requires resolution. And there was none, only continuation. The question remained, but it had changed. It was no longer, why did he do it? It was now, what happens next? Because now that she understood, the choice was hers, not his. For the first time, she was no longer reacting to his decisions. She was making her own. And that was the final shift. She could leave. She could walk away from everything. From him. From the system. From the control. But leaving would not erase the truth. It would not undo what had been done. It would not remove the connection that now existed between them, built on conflict, on strategy, on something that could not be easily defined. And that was the problem, because some connections do not disappear, even when they should. Arya stood still, not trapped, not controlled, but choosing. And that choice carried more weight than anything before it, because this time it was hers. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of everything that remained unresolved, everything that could not be undone, everything that had changed between them. And in that silence, she made her decision, not through words, not through movement, but through presence. She did not leave, and that changed everything. As the truth settled into something deeper, something more dangerous than control or betrayal, one final reality remained, quiet but undeniable. Even after everything, she doesn't leave him. He didn't rescue her. He chose her, and that was far more dangerous. The moment Arya chose not to walk away did not feel like an ending. It felt like a shift, not in the world around her, but in the position she now held within it. Because staying was not surrender, and it was not weakness. It was something far more complex, something deliberate, something dangerous. For the first time since everything began, Arya was no longer reacting to forces beyond her control. She was stepping into them, willingly. That was the difference. And that difference changed everything. The dynamic between her and Dante no longer resembled anything it had been before. It was not the same controlled distance, not the same undefined connection, not the same imbalance of power that had once placed her beneath his system. That version of her no longer existed. She was not the same person who had once stood within his world, trying to understand her place. Now, she understood it completely, and more importantly, she had chosen it. The intellectual hook settled into her with quiet intensity. The most dangerous place to stand is beside someone you understand but cannot escape. That was where she was now, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him. And that position was not safe. Dante's control had not disappeared. It had changed. Where it had once been strategic and distant, it was now something else, something more focused, more precise, more personal. Because she was no longer just part of his system. She was part of his attention. And attention, when sustained, becomes something else. Obsession. It was not obvious, not in the way others might define it. There were no visible cracks in his composure, no loss of control, no signs of emotional instability. But it was there, in the way his focus remained fixed on her, even when it had no reason to, in the way his presence adjusted around her, not to control her, but to account for her, in the way she was no longer treated as something to be used, but something to be kept. And that was far more dangerous, because being used has limits, but being kept does not. Arya recognized the shift for what it was, not protection, not possession, something deeper, something more complicated, something that could not be defined by simple terms like control or power. Because what existed between them now was not built on structure alone. It was built on understanding, and understanding creates connection, even in the darkest places. Her transformation was complete, not in a way that made her invincible, but in a way that made her aware. She no longer moved through his world trying to survive it. She moved through it knowing exactly what it was, and choosing to remain. Fear no longer controlled her decisions, because fear had been replaced by clarity, and clarity is far more dangerous than fear. She was not naive. She did not mistake this for something safe. She did not allow herself to believe that staying meant stability or security, because she understood the truth better than anyone else. Dante Moretti did not offer freedom. He offered control. But now, that control was different, because it no longer existed without her consent, and that consent changed the balance. They were no longer defined by the roles they had once occupied, not protector and protected, not controller and subject, but something else, something far more dangerous. Equals, not in power, not in influence, but in awareness. And awareness is the foundation of real control. The space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like tension, not unresolved, but ongoing, because what existed between them could not be simplified into something stable. It was built on contradiction, betrayal and protection, control and choice, distance and connection, and those contradictions could not be resolved, only maintained. Dante did not try to change that. He did not soften his presence. He did not reduce the intensity of what existed between them, because he did not need to. She had already chosen to remain, and that choice was enough. The world around them continued to operate as it always had, structured, controlled, unforgiving. Nothing about it had changed. The rules remained the same. The danger remained constant. But Arya had changed, and that made all the difference. Because she was no longer inside the system unknowingly. She was part of it, fully aware, fully conscious, fully involved, and that awareness made her dangerous in ways she had never been before. She was no longer something that could be moved without consequence, because now she understood the consequences. The emotional weight of everything that had happened did not disappear. It settled, not as pain, but as foundation, because everything that had shaped her, every moment of confusion, every realization, every shift in understanding, had brought her to this point. And this point was not escape. It was acceptance, not of him, but of the reality they existed within. A reality that did not allow simple endings or clean resolutions, only continuation. The connection between them remained, unresolved, unfinished, but undeniable. And that was what made it powerful, because it did not rely on illusion. It was built on truth, and truth does not fade. As everything settled into place, not peacefully, not comfortably, but completely, one final realization remained. This was not a story of being saved. It was a story of being claimed. And being claimed is not freedom. It is commitment to something you cannot easily leave, to something that does not release you, to something that becomes part of you, whether you want it to or not. As the weight of that truth settled fully into her, one final thought remained. Quiet, haunting, and impossible to ignore. Being claimed by him wasn't freedom. It was stepping into a world she could never escape.